How do you transpose into the Sicilian Scheveningen from other Sicilian variations? Have you ever wondered how to transition into the Sicilian Scheveningen from other Sicilian lines? It can be a bit tricky, but with the right moves, you can make it happen smoothly. The Sicilian Scheveningen is known for its solid pawn structure with pawns on e6 and d6, which allows for flexible piece play. Let's break down how to get there from various Sicilian variations. First, let's look at some common move orders that can lead you to the Scheveningen. One popular route is through the Najdorf variation. After the moves 1 pawn to e4, 1 pawn to c5, knight to f3, 1 pawn to d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight to f6, and knight to c3, black can choose to play pawn to e6 instead of pawn to a6. This choice allows you to steer towards the Scheveningen structure while avoiding the sharper lines of the Najdorf. Another way is through the Null or Paulsen variations. Starting with 1 pawn to e4, 1 pawn to c5, knight to f3, and pawn to e6, you can delay playing a 6 or queen to c7. This gives you the flexibility to play pawn to d6 later, which can lead you into the Scheveningen setup after moves like knight to f6 and bishop to e7. You can also reach the Scheveningen from the Classical Sicilian. If you begin with knight to c6, pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight to f6, and knight to c3, you can transition into the Scheveningen by playing pawn to d6 and then pawn to e6 instead of going for the dragon variation with pawn to g6 or the Najdorf with pawn to a6. Now, let's talk about some strategic techniques for transposing. One effective method is to delay playing pawn to a6 in Najdorf-inspired lines. By avoiding this move early on, you can commit to pawn to e6 first, guiding your game toward the Scheveningen. For example, after 1 pawn to e4, 1 pawn to c5, knight to f3, 1 pawn to d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight to f6, and knight to c3, playing pawn to e6 allows you to bypass the Najdorf's a6 move. Another technique is to develop your pieces flexibly. By playing bishop to e7 and castling early, you can support the e6-d6 center and align with the Scheveningen's classical plans. Additionally, adjusting your pawn structure is key. In null lines, if you start with pawn to e6, adding pawn to d6 instead of playing a 6 or queen to c7 can help you transition into a Scheveningen setup. When aiming for the Scheveningen, keep an eye on some key positional features. The e6-d6 structure is great for controlling the d5 and e5 squares. This often leads to pawn breaks like pawn to d5 or pawn to e5 later on. Also, players typically castle quickly and use bishop to e7 to reinforce the kingside before launching counterplay. Lastly, let's look at some practical examples. From the Najdorf, after 1 pawn to e4, 1 pawn to c5, knight to f3, 1 pawn to d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight to f6, and knight to c3, playing pawn to e6 directly transposes into the Scheveningen. In null variations, starting with 1 pawn to e4, 1 pawn to c5, knight to f3, pawn to e6, pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight to c6, knight to c3, pawn to a6, and bishop to e2 followed by pawn to d6 can also lead to a Scheveningen-like setup. Be cautious of common pitfalls as well. Playing pawn to a6 too early can lock you into Najdorf plans, making it harder to transition into the Scheveningen. Also, avoid misplacing your bishops by playing pawn to g6 or pawn to b5 early, as this can lead you away from the Scheveningen structure. By focusing on the e6-d6 structure and flexible piece development, you can successfully transpose into the Sicilian Scheveningen from various Sicilian lines, taking advantage of its solid center and dynamic counterplay.